right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon for the second part of our three-part series on COVID and corruption. I am interim director of the School of Politics and Global Studies. My name is Magda Hinojosa, and I am very thrilled to have Dr. Nnamdi Ibokwe with us here today. He is going to be giving this talk on corruption's comparative quagmire. Previously, you may have joined us for part one in this series, which was corruption in context, a question of law or normativity. In just a week or so, we'll have part three of this series on the social pandemic and institutional pathology. And we hope that you will also be able to join us for the third part of this series. We're really excited to have Dr. Ibokwe with us here today. He is a postdoc at ASU's Institute for Humanities Research. And we are thrilled that he is also lending some of his expertise to us in the School of Politics and Global Studies and doing this exciting lecture series for us. He is, as I mentioned, a virtual postdoc. I didn't mention the virtual part, a virtual postdoc with us. He's a political economist whose area of work sits within the tradition of international political economy with a focus on modernization and development economics. And I can tell you from having conversed with him previously that he has just an exciting research agenda and also some great stories about having done field work that I really enjoyed. Dr. Ibokwe's research explores how disparate development outcomes and conditions like corruption arrive and sit at the intersection of international politics, state institutions, and global economic policy. And we are really excited to have him talk to us about corruption, what causes corruption, and how to study corruption with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to him now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hinojosa, for that great intro. And we're back. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in again. Once again, thank you to the School of Politics and Global Studies, the Institute for Humanities Research, and everyone at ASU who took some time out, and wherever you are, took some time out to join us today. Very excited to be back with you guys. Part one was very engaging. We ended with some really, really riveting questions and some nice conversational back and forth in terms of looking at what corruption means and how we classify and understand corruption. My only hope is that this installment elicits the same level of thought and curiosity. We're tackling a slightly different topic, but still linked to the first talk. And if you weren't with us on the first talk, I'll just briefly review so you have some context coming into talk two. So law and normativity. The greatest takeaway from talk one was thinking about corruption and defining corruption. It's steeped in subjectivity. It's not bound by legality. It's not normative. There's no standard that you can export across the world. It's an ever-changing spectrum of actions and behaviors that appear real and illusory. Structural or behavioral corruption is this term that really can't be bound, right? We use examples of pork barrel politics and appropriation and rent seeking, and kind of gave context throughout the world and across time to show how the definition and understanding of corruption can be very fluid. So that's just a brief snapshot of what happened in talk one. But now that we understand some of the institutional contours of identifying what corruption is, this conversation looks to explore why corruption is, or how corruption is explained. Let's get started. So if talk one was animated by the question, what do we mean by corruption? This talk is animated by the question, what causes corruption? Simple query, but not very simple in understanding and getting to the bottom of it. It's a very important line of interrogation for social scientists and interdisciplinary studies, because corruption is always and often pointed to the great cause of fill in the blank. Economic stagnation, you look at corruption. Political instability, you look at corruption. Underdevelopment, social unrest, it has this powerful place in academia and in society generally where we just look at corruption as this phenomena. But although it consistently travels with this extreme language of descriptors and debilitating, threatening, crippling, endemic. Very rarely and seldom is it actually taken to task and understood or tried to be explained. I'll give you an example. In Nigeria, where I did a lot of my research, corruption is blamed for everything, right? Anything goes wrong, it's corruption. Now, you have those high-level events where it's clearly linked, like you think about Boko Haram and Islamic radicalism in Nigeria, you can point to corruption, or the recent development with SARS, you can point to corruption, or even something like the price of gas being too high in an oil-rich country, you can point to corruption. But it goes much deeper than that at times. If there's traffic in the streets in the morning, people throw their hands up and say, corruption. Or, you can't afford your kids' school fees, it's corruption. Your car broke down, bad hair day, whatever, it's corruption. And I know it's simplified, but it's very, very true. It resonates that deeply, where corruption is like an inherent part of Nigerians' DNA. And this is true for other places across the world as well. It's a form of a cultural inheritance almost, right? So you get your eyes from your mom, you inherit your smile from your dad, and you inherit corruption from the state. Corruption just is. And while it's deeply rooted and has significant impact in society, politics, and economics, it's not this magical phenomenon or spontaneously emerged behavior. There are causes, there are roots, there are foundations, there are antecedent variables. And trying to understand where corruption comes from is really what pushes this talk forward. Now, before we jump into some of these causal arguments that try and explain how corruption or why corruption, I want to take a step back and think about a critical feature of contemporary corruption scholarship, because it impacts the understanding of corruption broadly and specifically in contexts like Nigeria or wherever else you're looking to ask these kinds of questions. And I call it the comparative quagmire for a reason. Why quagmire? So with corruption scholarship and even popular studies of corruption, there's an overwhelming preoccupation with the comparative, right? And as a trained comparativist myself, I'm typically a proponent of this kind of method of study, but with corruption is a very slippery slope. I'll explain why. Corruption scholarship now has an unrelenting need to just describe degree, more corrupt, less corrupt, most corrupt, least corrupt. And in some geo-specific contexts, these degrees become exceptional, right? In Africa, you see corruption, it's regarded and looked at as something that we've never seen before. Well, what is this crazy thing they're doing there in the sub-Saharan region of Africa? We've never seen this before, but surely if you joined the conversation last time, you understand that these actions and activities are prevalent across the globe and across time. But when you look at degrees and you look at corruption being compared in this way, it gets very dangerous, again, slippery slope. Now, I understand why social scientists want to do this. It's very understandable. You always want to comprehend outcomes, disparate outcomes, why certain things turn out differently in different places. And that's all fine and well. There's a whole line of interdisciplinary studies that investigates in this manner. But with corruption, I feel as though leaning towards that too much is a bit misguided. So think about it. If there's no standard definition or agreed upon understanding of corruption across the geopolitical landscape, how can we then have superlative and comparative conclusions about corruption? If what occurs in one area, in one context, is vastly different to what occurs in another, and we have a hard time pinpointing and describing a definition that fits, then how do we say country A, country B, people Y, people X are more or less corrupt? That level of comparison becomes a little bit sticky. I'll give you an example, right? You've all heard the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, that's true. So, even though there's certain seemingly objective measures for attractiveness, symmetry in your face or whatever features, I would challenge anyone to take what they think as being attractive or beautiful, take that across the world and watch how you're met with such a different response, and whether you're right or wrong. So if beauty's in the eye of the beholder, I like to say corruption is in the eye of the observer. Who's watching? What are they watching? Why are they watching? All of these things come into play when we start looking at comparing corruption and tracking corruption in terms of degree across different landscapes. So the key question jumps out at you, right? If you don't have a definition, how are you measuring? How are you comparing? How do you circumvent this incoherence? Well, it's simple, or at least it's presented to be simple, in that you standardize corruption through measurement mechanisms and metrics that try and illustrate this cross-country comparative calculation. And that's largely what's been done. So let's pause and take a step and look at this measurement, because it really provides a foundation for much of corruption scholarship, or even popular conversations about corruption. And I defy you to find any work, article, paper, book, what have you, that goes into speaking about corruption, especially cause, and doesn't reference Transparency International or some other global index and say, well, if I'm looking at Singapore, or if I'm looking at South Africa, or whatever country you're looking at, this is where they rank on the scale. And that's always just accepted as law or fact. But we have to understand what those scales are actually representing, and what it means and how they're constructed before we kind of dig into why and how corruption really arises when you're looking at it analytically. So these indices that I just mentioned, they fall victim to the same definitional inefficiencies and subjectivities that they're trying to remedy. The landscape is looked at as, well, we don't have a definition, we don't have a consistent meaning, but why don't we just put the countries on a scale and we can understand it that way. One scholar, though, said that to measure corruption without understanding or agreeing on what it means is a confused and misguided process and a fool's errand. Now, I wouldn't go as far as saying ranking countries on a scale is a fool's errand, but there's certainly blind spots, and it can certainly get very, very tricky when you try and use that as a baseline for analysis. So let's go back to the examples for a moment, and think about measurement broadly first. So if we take countries and look at corruption, let's say bribery, or let's say embezzlement, and we look at countries like Nigeria or Bangladesh or Haiti, then you can say, well, those countries are more corrupt. We see that going on all the time. But then think about some of the more clandestine forms of corruption that we discussed: cronyism, clientelism, rent seeking. You can shift your analysis and look at more Western countries and say, well, if I can take into consideration the US credit default rating a few years ago, or the mortgage bailout, or the savings and loan bailout of the 1980s, then the United States looks a lot more corrupt on the scale of grand institutional corruption. So already you can see how it's not very balanced, and it's also subjective. And the methodology is important when we think about measuring corruption. And we'll quickly see how accumulating data in the way that it's done has error margins and application errors when you want to study why and how corruption. So I mentioned briefly Transparency International. There's a bunch of corruption metrics and barometers out there. The World Bank has one. There's a Global Economic Crime Report. There's a Global Integrity Report. And all these things come out to try and give you a better sense of the landscape of corruption. But remember, corruption is real and illusory. So some things you can see, but many things you cannot see. So then how do they measure? They can't do it empirically, so they do it by proxy. What does this mean? So these indices essentially are based on polls and surveys where they talk to experts or businessmen, some locals, and they say, well, assess corruption on a scale. You might be talking to an importer, exporter, or a textile worker in India, and then ask the question on a survey, well, what do you think is going on? Have you paid a bribe? What's the cost of doing business? Et cetera, et cetera. But these are just survey responses, right? And also, the surveys that are used often fluctuate. So in very corrupt, or what they label very corrupt countries, they use less surveys, 6, 8. And in least corrupt or less corrupt countries, they use far many more surveys, up to 19 or 20. So there's already some inconsistencies there. And there's a danger when you're rooting your results in something so based on perception and subjectivity. Think about it in terms of university rankings, right? So US News and World Report has probably one of the most popular ones where they rank universities. So think about if you wanted to rank universities in the state of Arizona and do away with, for a second, endowment or enrollment acceptance rate or student to teacher ratio or all of these things that you can line up empirically. Strip that away and just do a ranking based on asking teachers, principals, and students, what's the best school in Arizona? Now, they'll probably say Arizona State University. What's the worst school? They might say University of Arizona, who knows? But the point is, when you use that type of method, you're dealing in perception, you're not dealing in reality. You're dealing in the thought that people have, which can be influenced heavily, and we'll get into that shortly. So biases in these subjective views in these measurements can also be increased the more you increase someone's awareness or perception of something, right? You're more likely to perceive things if it's brought and put in front of you. The human psychology is interesting that way. So think about when we say Paris being the most romantic city in the world, right? If I did a poll and said, what's the most romantic city? 9 out of 10 people might say Paris. But what makes Paris the most romantic city in the world, right? A lot of cities have great music, great food, moonlight, sunsets. I mean, Vegas has an Eiffel Tower. So why not these other cities? Why not Venice? Why not Santorini or Rio? Why not Tempe? Why isn't that the most romantic city? There's no real empirical baseline to say Paris is the most romantic, but it's looked at as such, and it's derived this stature of being as such based on largely perception. Same with goods and services. Does Rolex make the best watches, or is it just looked at as being the best? If you really jump in and go into the horological mechanisms and the calibers and everything else that goes into a watch, it might not be the best, but the perception is that it is. And that perception goes a long way in influencing the mindset and ultimately influencing action, right? Some of these measurements become so self-fulfilling where it skews actual levels. If it's reproduced enough and it's said enough, then these environments in these countries that are looked at as most corrupt, eventually you start magnifying your awareness of corruption. And even internally in those spaces, you start accepting and inheriting a level of corruption that you feel that just is. It's part and parcel with who we are. So these influences can be very, very dangerous, again, when we're going to analyze the how and the why. And also with these measurements, when we think about the error margins, sometimes the difference in a score of 0.02 or 0.2 is a difference in demarcating corrupt or extremely corrupt. I mean, these degrees, I don't want to say that they're haphazard, but there's not really a strong scientific baseline for them if you're going underneath their methodology and looking at how they're coming to these conclusions. So subjectivity and perception become very problematic on multiple levels. Now, with corruption, these measures dominate the landscape so much that they're seen as objective facts, statistics. They're the empirical baseline for a lot of studies, as I mentioned. And they also become very self-referential. So they don't actually reflect an accurate depiction of what's corrupt or where corruption lives and exists. What they do is they reflect themselves. If you have enough perception-based indices and they're all looking at each other for cues or using the same methodology, then they reinforce the position that these countries may take up on these indices. And now you have global understandings of corruption that may not be rooted in anything but perception or subjectivity, especially when you're thinking about the definitional aspect, whereby corruption on its own is so diffuse and so steeped in subjectivity, right? So if it's steeped in subjectivity, I like to say that the measurement of corruption is covered by a specious blanket of doubt. You got to call into question the entire endeavor, because how it's populated, how it's constructed, and how it's portrayed has some real dangerous blind spots for analytical thought and for studying why and how. But perhaps the most impactful element of these measurement indices and these rankings of corruption is the alignment with development, right? The alignment with wealth, institutional functionality. Essentially, corruption becomes another name for poverty. If you're a poor country, you're corrupt. If you're a rich country, you are not. That's a very dangerous thing. When it becomes synonymous, where poverty equals corruption and wealth equals no corruption, well, we know that that's not true, but that becomes the status quo. Now, I would rebut this sentiment, but I don't think that I could do it much better than Samuel Huntington does when speaking of modernization. And this actually came up in the Q&A last time. But Huntington said of modernization and corruption, it's not the absence of modernity, but efforts to achieve it that produce political disorder. If poor countries appear to be unstable or corrupt, it's not because they are poor, but because they're trying to become rich. And that's, for me, that's very powerful. I'll say it again. If poor countries are unstable, it's not because they are poor, but because they are trying to become rich. Think about it think about trying to accelerate out of quicksand, right? Now, if you fall into quicksand, you're not sinking because you're obese or you're overweight or you're too heavy or whatever other extreme. Everybody will sink, but you start sinking because you're frantically trying to escape. You're frantically moving, accelerating, trying to get out, and then you get consumed. Now, parallel that to corruption. You're not poor or unstable because you're poor. You're unstable and corrupt because you're trying to become rich. You're trying to frantically get out of the quicksand. And a lot of that instruction has come from external sources that says it's time to mechanize, it's time to industrialize, it's time to adopt different technological advances, it's time to leave behind whatever you know inherently and organically, as far as economic growth development. If you're an agrarian society and farmers, and they say suddenly in the mid-century, well, no, it's time to adopt machinery. Well, now they're telling you to accelerate. Now they're telling you to frantically escape your position. So when you observe something like corruption, you have to think about the why. Now, this is a notion that has fueled a lot of my research. And it really forces one to critically think about how and why corruption arises and how we designate who is corrupt and who is not corrupt, especially on a scale. So that's just a quick note about, I know quick, it's been maybe 20 minutes, but a quick note about the measurement aspect, because it's really, really important when we think about how corruption is studied. It forms a backdrop and also the foundation for a lot of scholarship, because we jump off from a platform of, well, if I'm going to study corruption in Mexico, or if I'm going to study corruption in Brazil, let me look at where they rank. Oh, okay, they rank 133rd out of all the countries. So I'm now entering from a position of very corrupt, extremely corrupt. And if I'm going to study Sweden or Singapore or the United Kingdom, and I'm looking at these scales, and I'm looking at these rankings, and I see that they're top 10 least corrupt, I'm entering and I'm interrogating and I'm asking questions based on this position that has been, I don't want to say artificially developed, but questionably, or at least subjectively, we can agree, developed. But it's often the starting point and the jumping off point for a lot of interrogation and scholarship of corruption. So that's just a quick note about the measurement. Now let's pivot and come back. We took a step back, let's take a step back forward and look at comparison and analysis. So when we say what causes corruption, what are we really looking at? What are we really investigating and examining? So across disciplines, and we see this in anthropology, history, sociology, political science, what have you, a lot of corruption scholarship tends to be simplified into single variable and what's called monocausal explanations. All that means is there's a single cause, and that is a dominant factor that's supposed to explain why we see corruption. And this makes sense on a surface. So if you have a variable that you can use to explain corruption generally, or with a simple method, then it's very easy for you to export that and gauge corruption elsewhere or compare its presence. So these methods are seemingly useful, but they also have significant barriers to understanding. And there's two reasons why. First, a lot of these single variable methods become reductionists. And that means that the study of corruption under these auspices are reduced to one singular term. right? Most examinations of corruption don't look at the same thing. They look at drastically different things at different times, different moments in different regions, but they use one term. So if you're looking at clientelism in Japan in the 1950s, or you're looking at neo-patrimonial politics in Nigeria in the 1960s, or you're looking at electoral politics in the United States during the 19th century, and you're looking at vastly different modes of corruption, but you're just calling it corruption, you're reducing it so much that what you're trying to explain or investigate sometimes gets lost, right? So that's number one. It becomes reductionist. Number two, it becomes dichotomous. And all that means is you start looking at variables in either or terms, right? At one explanatory frame at a time. So scholars will ask, are causal factors in terms of what causes corruption internal or external? Is it A or is it B? Dichotomous, they're pushed to different terms, to different poles. Now, I'll give a few examples to cement this point. An internal look at causes of corruption would be something like religion, right? Or something like political ideology, or a big one is culture, right? That's a huge, huge instigating factor that a lot of scholars use to investigate corruption, culture. So let's take an example of culture. If you look at a country like Italy, is corruption part of Italian culture? I mean, surely you have La Cosa Nostra and the mafia, and we talked about rent seeking, and even some of their executive heads of state, Silvio Berlusconi has his own abusive history in terms of running that country and acting in a manner that's abusive and corrupt. But is that part of Italian culture? And it's not just the country. Let's think about the Italian diaspora, right? Some of the movies we love, The Godfather, Goodfellas, The Sopranos, remember our pizza store from last time in the 1970s in Manhattan, where I was giving the example of rent seeking, right? Is this part of their culture? Is this a fair assessment? Is this accurate? Or is it inconsistent if you look at Italy regionally or from a city perspective, or even in a diaspora sense? Can you attach something like culture to corruption and say, I can explain why you see high levels of corruption in Italy, just look at the culture. There's something about the social arrangements and the social institutions or their history of being that gives rise to this behavior. That's one mode of analysis. A second mode of analysis is not the internal, but the external. So looking at things outside of a country. Typically, this comes in the form and in the shape of either economics or resource dependency, exploitative relationships, right? So let's think about Iraq and its oil production and connect that to transnational capital and those interests, those international stakeholders. Now, you can see that there's corruption in Iraq. You can see abuse of power surrounding oil reserves. We've seen the level of defense contracts increase. We've seen multiple wars waged on that soil. We've seen profiteers during the Gulf War. We talked about Halliburton last time. We see corruption, but if you take Iraq and look at the scale, look at some of these measurement indices, it usually falls somewhere in the middle, but we see corruption. But thinking about the external mode of investigation, you take these external stakeholders and their interests in a resource like oil in Iraq, and you use that to explain corruption. There's names that are given to it, rentier state, comprador state, basically any resource that derives rents from external sources where the government is then able to extract capital or profit. You're then explaining corruption and behavior based on that externality. So these are usually the dichotomous nature of studies of corruption, internal and external. But if you think about Italy, it can't only be culture, there have to be external features, right? Something is going on externally that animates some of the variables that you're going to point out and point to explain corruption. And if you look at Iraq, similarly, it can't just be these external exploitative economic relationships. There have to be features internally. There have to be social modes of something that gives rise or contributes to causes or antecedent variables that result in corruption. So most scholarship exists in one of these two poles. They are in competing corners, internal or external. There's a wave of new scholarship, though, that is coming out that is looking to bridge this gap. And my own research falls into this category where it's not monocausal, it's not single variable, it's not internal or external, it's multi-causal, it's combinational. All right, what does this mean? Let's use Nigeria again. If you look at corruption scholarship in Nigeria, they'll look internally. They'll say, well, colonialism created certain vestiges of social constructs that have endured over time. And then you have tribalism. And then you have extreme contestations for power. And then you have battles for resource and what have you. And then you get corruption, right? That's one internal look. It's a very popular one. And I'm not saying it's not without merit, but it's a very popular look at how to explain corruption in a place like Nigeria. Or you can look externally and say, well, if you think about their resource, you think about the exploitative relationship surrounding this dominant export, this oil. You know, after the oil crisis in the 1970s with the Yom Kippur War, the world's attention turned to Nigeria's reserves. And then you see this commodity. And then you see all of this capital flow in. And then you see abuse. And then you see corruption. Another fair assessment, another fair line of argument. But how do they exist separately? They're not both incorrect. Can they both be correct, right? A caused B, X caused Y, democracy caused, religion caused, oil caused. There's these straight line arguments, but when getting from A to B, there's a considerable gap. And combining variables and combining methods in a way to make up for and attend to those gaps is where, at least for me, I believe scholarship should tend to and trend to really comprehensively answer questions about how you get corruption in certain regions, right? So personally, I have a co-evolutionary model of endogenous and exogenous factors to investigate corruption in Nigeria. Now, if you're interested in that sentence, maybe we can arrange another talk either later this year or next semester, and I can use an hour and just talk about my research because it's really fascinating. I actually interviewed over 60 military officers, both active and retired in Nigeria, and they had quite a lot to say about Nigeria and corruption. So I'd love to share those stories, but I can't jump into that and just kind of give you a surface view. So maybe that's another discussion, maybe that's another talk. But the point is, methodologically, if you're analyzing corruption, you're looking to understand corruption, it's got to be more comprehensive, right? The point that I'm trying to make largely is that the burden of deciphering corruption can't be left to observers or perceivers, right? Understanding corruption should not be relegated to single variables, one thing, or internal and external designation, one method, but rather it should get to the core of the environment you're investigating. So for me, it's more meaningful to export your method rather than your variables, right? So if you think about corruption analysis, and whether you're trying to identify corruption, have a causal analysis of corruption, look at prescriptive measures of corruption, it needs to be targeted, it needs to be context specific. And the methods travel, but the variables stay home. So culture, right? If you're investigating Italian culture and what happened in the history of Northern Italy, Southern Italy, Sicily, etc., that analysis, those details, that culture, that stays home, right? Political institutions. If you're trying to understand the construction of political institutions in South Africa pre and post apartheid, and looking at the modalities and the dynamics between how the country was then moving forward or backward, depending on your position on that topic, those political institutions, that history, that stays home, right? Economic modes of production. If you want to look at the history of economic institutions and how a country modernized, industrialized, et cetera, that stays home. It all stays home. All the features are left in the environment where you found them. But the methods that you use to understand these variables and see how they connect, that's what should travel. So in understanding corruption, and I don't mean to sound preachy, but I feel very passionate about this sometimes, in trying to understand how and why corruption, it's not enough to just say, well, here A happened, so let's see if A happened elsewhere. Here B happened, let's see if B happened elsewhere. It's more important to say, here, corruption happened because of a confluence of certain events and a method that you use to understand how A, B, and C are present. You take that method and you export that somewhere and say, well, if I'm analyzing and investigating corruption in this manner, what variables can I point to in this other context? So you're still achieving and performing a certain level of comparative study, but not a simple one, not a surface one, not one where it's just perception and subjectivity and you just list countries on a ranking based on interviews, right? Not to simplify, but essentially a lot of corruption scholarship is centered around these dynamics. So this discussion thus far has looked at the comparative quagmire, the analytical modes of corruption scholarship. But that's not to say that insights aren't present. It's not to say that they're so elusive. You know, despite some of these criticisms and despite some of these points that I'm highlighting, a lot of the work on corruption is still very, very insightful and very, very interesting, right? There's work done in certain contexts where, you know, it can ignite certain modes of thinking that allow you to say, well, let me explore it in this manner. And that's the key takeaway, is that the quagmire for comparativists and trying to be comparative is there's a slippery slope. If you're starting from a point of not understanding fully what something means and designating definition, and then immediately move to trying to stratify based on more or less, most or least, and then use that foundation to then ascribe cause, well, maybe that scholar is right. Maybe it is a fool's errand. But again, insights are there and understanding is certainly there. But in as much as we try and look back and say, well, what caused corruption? Sometimes, rarely, there are punctuated, often global moments of crisis and change. And these moments of crisis and change force a level of disequilibrium in politics and economics that are very, very clearly antecedent to corruption. So these punctuated global moments that you can point to and say, this happened, and now we see this behavior, now we see this activity. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's a very, very interesting realm to jump into. Saw it with the Great Depression, right? We saw it with the atom bomb in the world wars. We saw it with the advent of the World Wide Web and the internet, right? We saw it with the Arab Spring. We see it with global pandemic. Now, let's leave it there for now. We'll pick up next time at global pandemic, COVID, corruption, and hopefully the backdrop that I've laid over the last two lectures will allow you to see where corruption can be present, but where it really stems from, and understanding this intersectionality of this punctuated moment, this global pandemic, this massive crisis and change, and how you get corruption immediately and directly stemming from that, and understanding those modes of corruption. It may not always be what we tend to think it is. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less, but at least we'll interrogate it with that vantage and look at corruption in that way. So I'm happy to open up the floor to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibokwe. That was terrific, really fantastic. And I love how you've left us hanging to hear what happens in the third part of this series. So just for anyone who doesn't know, the third part is on the social pandemic and institutional pathology. It's going to be next Wednesday, November 18th from 3 to 4 via Zoom. So very much looking forward to that and getting started with some questions. So we have one question from the audience now, and so I'm going to go ahead and read that out to you. Can we simplify the question of what is corruption to an examination of differentiated treatment? If you get a service for free, but I have to pay for it, that's corruption. If everyone pays a fee for the service, but the money from one fee collector is not given to the service provider, while the money from another is, that is corruption. So would you mind responding to that question?
Yeah, I want to make sure I get the question right. So simplifying the question, simplifying what is corruption to examining differential treatment across, assumed social norms. I think that is the gift and the curse of studying something like corruption, because simplification is always preferred. It's always better to try and break it down so everyone can understand and know exactly what you're dealing with. Largely, that's what I was advocating in the talk, is that you have to be specific and direct. The curse of that is then everything becomes open to analysis.
Mhm.
Everything becomes corruption. Everything becomes, well, is that corruption? You know, if my lawn guy says he's gonna come and trim my hedges, but he only spends 5 seconds and then says, well, you know, I did, but here I'm still gonna charge you, or you feel like you've gotten, you know, I don't want to say robbed, but you don't feel that you've got satisfactory service for something that you paid for, is that corruption? These are all social behaviors that can constitute. I would just caution and say when you reduce it to that social level, then a lot of behavior can just be deemed as corruption, and rightfully so. But for the purposes of this talk and for these questions, I like to put corruption on the plane institutionally, right? What is happening fundamentally on a more foundational level in society where, in as much as social interactions do constitute, but what is happening from a higher level and a higher plane? So I don't know if that answered your question, but yes, you certainly can, but there's a danger, especially if you're thinking about it analytically, to just say, well, this is corruption, this is corruption, this is corruption, because then how do you differentiate from a higher level, a broader level? And then if you're, you know, if you want to compare, then you get into some of these issues that I've been talking about over the length of this talk.
Thank you so much. So we've still got about 15 minutes. If anyone has questions they'd like to ask, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in a question, and I'll happily read it out to Dr. Ibokwe so that we can get his response. And in the meantime, I'm just going to ask him a question myself. And apologies, but I was not able to make it to your first talk. So hopefully I'm not infringing too much on the topic of that discussion. But I was hoping you might be able to speak to some of the cultural variation that we see in conceptualizing corruption and how we might deal with, say, an issue like nepotism, whether it is something that is considered corruption in some instances, but maybe not in other places or times, and how scholars can reconcile that and work through something like that.
Yeah, no, that's a foundational question. And it came up briefly in the talk last time, but the cultural nuance aspect, right? How do you parse out and differentiate gift giving and patronage, or things that are just allowed and understood or expected in some social contexts in some places, from outright abuse of power and bribery? And that is the issue, because a lot of the times, again, to connect back to this talk, who is watching, who is doing the observing, who's doing the perceiving? If you're coming in externally and trying to assess corruption based on your own understanding, and you're going to a foreign area, then inherently you're going to have this collision. You're going to have these inconsistencies. And if you take that and say, well, now I'm going to understand and explain corruption, well, you know, it's misguided in a sense. Now, the solution, I think, for scholars or for anyone doing this investigation, you have to be as context specific and culturally specific as you can. I mean, I had the benefit of investigating corruption in a place that I know. You know, Nigeria, I'm Nigerian, I grew up there. In part, I'm very connected, so I was able to navigate some of the labyrinths of understanding what is allowable, what is permissible, what is expected, etc. If you're not, I would just say to do as much groundwork as you can. If you're doing field work, just trying to be as ingrained in that culture as possible, to try and lift off your studies and, you know, examine and address the questions that you want to have answered in a way that might be a little more relevant than just doing it from afar. It's almost like learning a language. You can, you know, put on whatever app and try and learn a language until you get there and you realize you're speaking a different language than the natives. So it requires work. I'm actually a proponent of area studies in that sense, where you really specialize and then try and extract causal revelations or insights in that way. I know that that's not something that's really popular now, or something that people have the luxury of doing, but that is the issue with corruption and studying something like this. There's just so many blind spots, there's just so many contours that you have to navigate, and it's difficult, but that would be my advice, is to try and be as context specific as possible.
Terrific, thank you so much. We have another question that has come in. In your study of corruption scholarship, have you stumbled upon a method or cure for corruption?
Yes. So as many definitions as there are for corruption, there's an equal number of cures for corruption.
Mhm.
And, scholars will tell you that all you have to do is increase your industrial output, increase your GDP, lower your infant mortality rate, or you have to just protect your political institutions, or you have to do X, Y, and Z. The problem inherent with all of these remedies for corruption is what they're trying to do typically is Xerox and stencil what happened in one area, take that to somewhere else and say, well, now this can work. So just like explaining corruption why is misguided if you're just copying and pasting, curing corruption is similarly misguided if you're just copying and pasting. And there's so many that come to mind, but again, context really, really matters. The history and the space that you're exploring and you're investigating really, really matters. But there's several. You can go up online or go into any journal and find several prescriptive works on this is how we get rid of corruption. All we have to do is be more transparent. Let's set up this agency that's going to now be the watchdog, and then that agency becomes corrupt. So yes, there are several cures. I don't have the answers, but that's what makes a topic like this so interesting and so exciting is that, it's ever moving, ever evolving. And sometimes you stumble on things that are very, very interesting. And then sometimes you stumble on things where you just shake your head and say, how is that going to work? But it always keeps the wheels turning.
Terrific. So it seems like in answering that last question and in answering my previous question, that certainly in-depth knowledge of a case is really important. That field work is important. And I'm a proponent of that myself. I'm just wondering, does that mean we can't do large and quantitative analyses of corruption?
It doesn't. And you have to be careful with how you do it. So I talked about a lot of subjective studies and indices in the talk, but there are equally some objective measurement studies that have come up, right? So, scholars will take, the number of convictions of public officials, or they'll take something empirical that they can actually measure and say, well, the difference between public money spent and the quantity of physical infrastructure in a certain area. And that can derive certain conclusions and you can get a larger sample, surely. But when you go deeper into that data and think about how it's represented, what if the country that you're comparing or you're including in that sample doesn't have the same judiciary function or ability to prosecute and bring corruption to justice in the same way, right? And even if you're thinking about, underdeveloped or regionally having the same construction, there's still differences. And those differences are always going to betray an outcome, because when you're trying to have an objective analysis or conclusion with something that is inherently hard to define and measure, then it's a challenge and it can be interesting, but you got to be very, very careful with the underlying data, because the construction of the different variables at play are always going to be very heterogeneous. You're not going to be able to get a baseline similarity.
Thank you. We've gotten another really interesting question from the audience. So the question is there a difference between influence, like political influence, and corruption? And this individual mentions the perceived influence of the Chinese government or institutions, Chinese institutions, on the type of infrastructure being developed in, say, Ghana. Mm-hmm. Could this be viewed as corruption? So again, to distill it, it would be this difference between political influence and corruption. Is there a difference? Are they one and the same?
So I'll be careful with the answer. They're not necessarily one and the same, but in the context of the way I look at corruption, I would say that it's more so influence than it is corruption. And let's look at what that influence means. But if you're inclined to look at corruption, then you can say, well, then yes, that influence is a form of clientelism or cronyism. So what question are you trying to have answered? And I'm always wary to take a step back and not present it like everything is corruption. It's the kitchen sink. Anything you look at is corruption. I'm very wary of that. But when you talk about political influence from an external country into a developing country, which has a lot to do with either infrastructural work or energy investing and things of that nature, inherently you're going to get this influence slash this corrupt relationship, patron-client relationship, and then you have to really ask what's going on here. So I would say it's corruption, but like, what question are you really trying to investigate? And that will animate your answer more. So that's how I'd respond to that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's such a fascinating question. And the line of where corruption is I'm sure one that you often have in your own work tried to figure out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think there's like a temporal issue here as well, where the line of what corruption is it moving back in any way? Are we receding and considering things to be corrupt that maybe just a generation ago were not considered corrupt acts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think time is a very crucial feature. We have to be careful to not designate corruption as just being epiphenomenal with time, like something happens, something's corrupt. But certainly, if you look at more contemporary moments of, designating corruptions, it's gone back to really being more critical of what we understand as being corrupt. So if you think about certain development patterns in the 19th century or in the 18th century even, and we said point blank, clearly that was corruption, we have a tendency to remove that label especially for developed countries, especially in a contemporary moment. So if you're expected to go through corruption or obvious abuses of institutions in your history, well, if you're a country that's 30 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old, and it was the 19th or 18th century, that's expected, and we'll easily designate that's corruption. But if you're a developed nation, if you're the United Kingdom, and you're dealing with an issue, whether it's the currency issue of the 90s, Brexit, and you see other things that happen that are clearly corrupt, we're less likely, or have been less likely, to point and say corruption. It's increasing now, and I don't know if that is a testament to the dynamic change of different institutions and societies and political structures, perhaps. I think it's also in relation to how corruption is being studied and understood, that is no longer seen as specific to a certain region, specific to a certain time. It's not a African country or Latin American country that's corrupt when a military ruler is in power. It can be a democratic nation, a Western nation, is corrupt when an elected president is in power.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another question. Does the illusory and subjective nature of corruption make it easier for the US and other powerful states in certain situations to sidestep confronting allied states where levels of corruption are significant? If this is the case, what can be done to bring more clarity to defining and confronting corruption?
I'm gonna have to look at that one again. Absolutely. I would say an emphatic yes, that it makes certain dealings, especially in terms of diplomacy and in terms of dealing with other countries, a lot easier to sidestep confronting where levels of corruptions are significant. There's a work that this reminds me of. It's called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And it's not considered academic, but it's really considered a biographical and almost like a tell-all of economic development during the late 20th century and what the United States position was in influencing regime change, influencing or ignoring certain allies and their requests, and sidestepping or overlooking modes of blatant corruption for their own gain. And this question reminds me of that. So yeah, I would say that it's an emphatic yes. What can be done to bring more clarity to defining and confronting corruption? I mean, you're asking people to tell on themselves at that point. At that high level, there is no impetus, there is no benefit to then reveal. Maybe like in the case of this book, once you're out of it, you can then shine a light on it, you can blow the whistle. But once you're in it, there's no impetus to say, well, actually, all of these negative things are happening, all these abuses are happening. And if you do try and do that, you'll probably find that you're no longer in that position of power. So.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. I think we're pretty much out of time here, so I would like to thank you so much, Dr. Ibokwe, for this really fascinating talk I know that I'm really looking forward to talk number 3, which again will be Wednesday, November 18th at 3 o'clock. And we're really looking forward to it, and especially to see how this conversation that you have now started with us on corruption then gets us to our current global pandemic. So I'm really excited to see what you've got in store for us. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.